Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Justinian and Theodora Part 6, Fighting for Rome. So last time we saw the beginning of Belisarius' campaign to retake Italy, conducted on behalf of Justinian, whose ambition it was to reconquer the lost western provinces of the Roman Empire. Today, judging from the title, we will see the continuation of that campaign. Now, before we get into this one, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon. It is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Belisarius camped at Neapolis, and he waited. The road to Rome lay open, but he'd never hold Italy if what happened to Neapolis happened there. Barbarian mercenaries pillaging churches, looting from holy sites. He had written to the Pope. With a papal invitation, his men would march in as liberators, not as conquerors. And in the months he'd waited, word had filtered down from the north. The barbarians, the Ostrogoths, had held a great conclave after he had taken Neapolis. They were tired of their weak usurper king. The Ostrogothic noble who had started all of this had been overthrown. He'd been replaced by a man named Vidiges, who had hunted him down and, though they were Christians, slaughtered him like a sacrifice at the altar, at least if rumors were to be believed. On the one hand, this was ill luck for Belisarius. The greedy, vacillating Ostrogothic king was perhaps one of his greatest allies in this fight. So far, he'd taken half of Italy without real opposition. On the other hand, this instability had caused Vidiges to withdraw from Rome to rally his forces in the north, leaving the city truly open.
Yeah, so we kind of talked about this last time, how following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, there were some Ostrogothic kings, Odoacer, Theodoric in particular, and even beyond them, who essentially continued to rule as vassals of Rome, vassal kings of Eastern Rome, and there was a bit of an uneasy alliance. And these kings had to sort of work between their Ostrogothic allies, oftentimes in high places in the army, and, the citizens they were ruling over, the Roman Italians of their territory. This could be a little tricky sometimes, right? It might be hard to appease one group without upsetting the other, and we're seeing that tension kind of erupting here. Belisarius, as we've talked about, was doing a bit of a hearts and minds campaign as he was reconquering this territory. His approach was that this was territory populated by Romans that rightfully belonged to the Roman Empire. And so he wanted to get these people on his side, and he wanted to get them, opposing their Ostrogothic overlords, to frame it in that way, or just the Ostrogothic nobles, kings, and military commanders who were ruling over them. The idea is to bring these Romans back into the fold of the Roman Empire, right? Because that's how they viewed it. This was Rome's rightful territory. And a big part in that was probably coordinating with the Pope. Now, we also talked about this last time. You don't have the official split between what would become Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox Christianity at this point, but there is definitely tension between the East and the West. The most important figure in the East is the Patriarch of Constantinople, and in the West, it is the Pope of Rome. So that's an important person to get on your side if you want to get the people of this region on your side.
With the blessing of the Pope, Belisarius would take what had once been the greatest city in the world without unsheathing his sword. It was a long wait, but at last, the Pope's blessing had come. They had marched as soon as they'd had word.
Originally, by the way, the system was you essentially had four important patriarchs, of Christendom, one in Rome, one in Constantinople, I believe one in Alexandria, and then I can't remember the fourth location for the life of me. I'm sure someone will remind me down below. But you essentially had four of these important Christian religious leaders, but over time, the ones in Constantinople and Rome became the most important, and of course would sort of become the centers of these two different branches of Christianity, Orthodoxy and Catholicism.
The 10th day of December, they reached Rome, and for the first time in 60 years, Rome was once again ruled by Romans. Belisarius sent the keys of the city back to his good friend Justinian as a sign that...
Frankly, officially the first time in those years, but even before the collapse of the West, A lot of the ruling was not done by quote-unquote real Romans. Those barbarians, and as we mentioned, barbarians was really just anyone who wasn't Roman. Those barbarian generals and politicians were already doing a lot of the ruling even before the emperor in the West was overthrown.
That together, they had once again made the emperor the ruler of Rome. With this gift, though, he also sent a request for more men. After leaving yet another garrison in Neapolis, he could muster barely 5,000 men to hold the Eternal City. Rome was in Ostrogothic territory. Though the Ostrogoths were disorganized and some of their force were scattered, they could still levy tens of thousands. As soon as they reorganized and collected their forces, they'd be back. If he was to last out the winter with his handful of men, he would have to see to the defense. He put his men to work on rebuilding the crumbling Aurelian walls, while he had the populace restock the city's granaries. And as the walls rose and the granaries filled, he considered his situation. His position was perhaps not as desperate as it looked. The Aurelian walls were high and mighty. The Tiber River ran straight through the city, so they could be certain of fresh water. The grain they had just brought in to stock their own larders would deprive any opponent of living off the countryside.
I will say, I do wonder how long-term Justinian thought this conquest was going to be. Now, of course, from our position, we know that it didn't actually last very long. That territory was not really brought back into the fold of the Roman Empire. It was reconquered and lost forever to the Roman Empire. I mean, there was still a relationship between Rome and its former territories, but the Eastern Roman Empire would not politically control those territories in the long term. So we know that in the moment, right, Justinian doesn't, and of course he was a very ambitious guy, but I have to think he must have recognized how sort of untenable this was, how many resources it would take, how difficult it would be to reconquer so much territory. Now, in his time, as we've talked about, people could still remember when there was a existing Western Roman Empire. They could remember when this territory was controlled by Rome, and so it wasn't impossible to imagine it would be again. But just on a practical level, that takes a lot of effort, manpower, and resources, and I don't know, but I do wonder sort of what Justinian's calculus on that was.
And his Ostrogothic foes had little mastery of siege warfare. His only fear was that his 5,000 men were far too few to man the 12-mile circuit of the walls. He would need reinforcements, or he'd have to press the citizenry into service to watch for an attack. Winter passed into early spring. It was the 11th of March, and Belisarius' enemy still hadn't arrived. Roman scouts in the north had told him of an Ostrogothic horde on the march, but he hadn't seen him yet. His garrison at the Salarian Bridge hadn't reported in this morning. It might be nothing, but he feared they had met with Ostrogothic vanguard.
Uh-oh.
The position was strong, and a few men could hold there against a much larger force for quite some time. He would take his elite cavalry and investigate. If his force at the bridge had run into the enemy, his heavy cavalry, plus the men manning the bridge towers, might be able to do enough damage to convince the Ostrogothic vanguard to wait for the main Ostrogothic force, rather than trying to push their way across the river, which would give him more time to prepare the city itself. As he led his men across the countryside, he could feel it. Something was wrong. Suddenly, they were upon him. The men at the tower had fled without a fight, and the Ostrogoths had already crossed the river. Their advanced forces swarmed around him before his men were even prepared. Then he heard it, in the rough Gothic tongue. "The white-faced bay! Fire on the white-faced bay!" They'd recognized his famous steed. Showers of arrows and darts fell upon him. Only the thickness of his armor and the strength of his shield kept him from 1,000 different deaths. "To Rome! Ride, men, ride!" His men...
Hey man, you read, about the experiences of Belisarius. This was a man who, he was very brave, he was a leader, he often found himself in danger. Often, there's, with a lot of these great sort of military leaders of history, there's a combination of skill and luck. There are several moments when, frankly, Belisarius' life was only saved by luck. Luck that he wasn't struck down and killed in an instant, and that he was able to keep on going.
Crowded around him, covering him with their shields. They hewed their way out, cutting down foe after foe in a furious melee. It was chaos, dust and horses and screams all about, but then they were through. They'd broken through the enemy line and were riding on to Rome. "To the gates, men!" he shouted. But at the gates they refused to let him through. The soldiers on the walls didn't recognize him, covered in the mud and gore of the field.
Oh, man.
He shouted at them, and they argued as the Ostrogoths got ever closer. They were nearly upon him now. Men, at least we could die with glory, he shouted, and spurred his exhausted horse to...
Hey, not the worst time someone hasn't been recognized by their own men. I think of, say, Stonewall Jackson in the American Civil War, who, when coming back to camp, was mistaken for an enemy by his men and was killed. So, not getting let in, not great, definitely not ideal in that moment, but at least you weren't struck down dead.
charged the approaching horde. His men followed with him. They would go out as one last gleaming, glorious charge of Rome. But the pursuing barbarians were out of formation and not expecting an attack. His countercharge was devastating, and now it was the barbarians' turn to flee. Seeing all this from the ramparts, the garrison relented and let him re-enter the safety of the city, realizing that anybody attacking their enemy with such savagery must be their allies.
Yeah.
Time passed, and the Ostrogoths...
You gotta imagine them sitting there on the walls like, should we let that guy in? Maybe he actually is Belisarius. Look at him go.
...in for a siege. They cut the aqueducts. For the first time in 1,000 years, Rome was without running water. But more on Belisarius' mind was that without the aqueducts to power the mills, he couldn't process the grain they'd stored up into flour, and without that, the city would starve. He'd been thinking on this problem for some time. He had a solution, but it was a wild one. He would put mills on boats. He would put them on boats, and he'd put them on the Tiber. He would then put a water wheel between the boats, and so long as the boats were moored to both banks of the river by good taut rope, they would stand still, and the wheel would turn. And so, the Tiber flowed, and the grain flowed,
Wow.
and the people had bread.
I mean, hey, that is some ingenuity. I do not know if I would have thought of that solution.
But as the Ostrogoths learned of this solution, they tried to counter it by tossing trees and
Yeah,
corpses
perhaps a little more vulnerable to enemy attack, though.
into the river to break the ropes holding the mills in place. But to this too, Belisarius had a solution. He had a large chain stretched across the river, and simply had the men fish out anything that got stuck on it well before it reached the floating mills. And so, the populace of Rome was fed, but they
Wow.
were nervous. Inactivity breeds desperation in men. All the tradesmen and farmers and merchants had nothing to do. They couldn't practice the crafts to which they'd become accustomed, and so simply sat in their houses and talked. Talked at times of how it might be better if they surrendered. Belisarius saw only...
Yeah, it's interesting to see Rome in this state. We sort of talked about this last time, how this is not the Rome you think of when you think of the Roman Empire. Well, of course, this is a post-Roman Empire Rome. But, even in the last couple decades, 100-plus years of the Roman Empire, Rome, the city, was not as grand as it had been in prior years. It had lost its importance, a lot of its status, frankly, due to just political and military circumstances. As the empire became more chaotic and split up, it became less effective as a base of operations for the emperor and the military, and emperors began to station themselves closer to the provinces, and Rome declined. It had lost a lot of its population. It was still a city that meant something. It had a legacy. It was an important symbol. It had a lot of important architecture and monuments. But a lot of that at this point was kind of crumbling. It hadn't been tended to. A lot of it was falling down. It certainly wasn't the city with the grandeur that you imagine. And of course, Constantinople had been the center of definitely the Eastern Roman Empire, but even sort of the Roman Empire overall, the West and the East. By the end, Constantinople was the most impressive city in that empire, not Rome.
only one option. He would make them soldiers. He wouldn't merely press them into service, he would give them pay. He would organize them into squadrons. He would make them proud to be Romans again. And with them, he would finally have...
I mean, this is a real callback, you know? This is a callback to the good old Roman Republic, when the armies of Rome were still filled by sort of, you know, Roman, Italian, civilian soldiers. It had been hundreds and hundreds of years since this kind of thing. I mean, not at all, like, you know, obviously. But if you look at the history of the Roman Empire, most of it involves Rome's armies being made up of not people from the Italian peninsula, you know, people from all throughout the Roman Empire. So this isn't super meaningful, but on sort of a symbolic level, it is interesting to see, you know, citizens of Rome take up arms to defend the city.
have enough men to watch the walls. The enemy was upon him. Today was, at last, the day. Men from the wall had just come to his camp to tell him that siege engines had approached. Great towers made for storming the battlements had been seen rolling toward them, and rams, covered, wheeled, and dragged by oxen, slowly made for his gates. Belisarius rode to the walls. He could see the fear in their eyes. His Romans, soldiers though he tried to make of them, were terrified of these machines of war. He surveyed the battlefield. Then he laughed. He took the bow from his back and loosed 3 arrows. 3 riders fell, and a cheer went up along the wall.
Really?
Fire at the oxen, men.
See, that's one of those moments. It's a little too cinematic. You know what I mean? Do I really believe Belisarius loosed 3 arrows and each of them hit their mark? Probably not. Maybe something like that happened, but I imagine we get this from Procopius, maybe, or some other historian. That's probably a bit of exaggeration. You know what I mean? Remember, if we are, and I don't know if the source of this is Procopius, or not, but if it is Procopius, we're writing a bit of imperial history here. He wrote his secret history in which he was very negative on the people who surrounded him, but in the official history, he pretty positively portrayed these people. Plus, you know, these ancient historians, or we're kind of moving past antiquity, but I'll lump Procopius in. They loved a bit of exaggeration, you know?
He shouted. The siege was on. The hail of arrows from his defenders had felled the oxen dragging the Ostrogothic war machines, leaving the machines dead, inert hulks like the skeletons of giants just sitting in the fields before Rome. But while Belisarius had stopped the main assault, another force had gotten over one of the lower walls on the other side of the city with the aid of siege ladders. He whipped his famous steed along the city walks, gathering whatever troops he could to ride with him as he flew along the streets of Rome. As he reached the walls, he saw it. The men there were hard-pressed. He knew his small force wouldn't be enough to turn the tide upon the wall. But there was still one option. The men who were with him were horsemen. They'd be of little use on the ramparts, but out in the field, well... "Open the gates," he bellowed, and as the melee swirled on the walls above, he charged his men out, beyond the safety of the city. His cavalry crashed into the Ostrogoths still waiting to get up.
I mean, risky move, but if you're struggling to defend your city from this siege, and we've talked about he doesn't have enough men to man these walls, a lot of these soldiers are just civilians, very lightly trained for this. They're not ready. If you had this cavalry force, it might be time to sully out and take the action to your opponent. Try and engage in a skirmish that drives them away. Risky, but it could save the city.
Up the siege ladders, and they broke, scattered before this terrifying assault, leaving the attackers already on the wall cut off. Belisarius looked out on the piles of ash standing before Rome. His men had reduced the immobile war engines to soot with arrows of fire. He had won the day. But how many more days? Even though the victory was great, it wasn't without its cost. How many more victories until he had no men left? He decided he would write again to Justinian.
Yeah, I mean, you think of the Roman Empire, Rome should be home base. But that is not the Roman Empire we're dealing with. This is more the home base of the Ostrogoths than it is the Romans at this point. The Ostrogoths, this is where their empire is based. They can draw on reinforcements, resources. Rome is centered in Constantinople. They only recently reconquered Roman territory in North Africa, and so in order to send over resources and reinforcements, that takes a lot of effort and mobilization. Belisarius can't necessarily draw from the territory around him, at least not that much. He needs reinforcements to be sent from Constantinople, so this takes a lot more effort for the Romans, Justinian, to send men and resources his way than it does for the Ostrogoths, who are closer to their home base, frankly.
Finally, troops arrived. They'd been held up by bad weather in Greece. The bulk of his reinforcements were still there, but 1,600 cavalry had made their way to him, and 1,600 cavalry was just what he needed. He took to regularly raiding any group of Ostrogoths that separated from the main force. His troops would charge in, shred these groups with bowfire from horseback, and retreat to the safety of the walls before the main Ostrogothic army could catch him. But still they suffered. His supplies were dwindling. Citizens from the city would beseech him daily to let them at least die in battle rather than starve to death within their homes. At last he relented. They would have battle. And that battle was a close one. His cavalry had driven back the Ostrogoths, starting a rout, but his infantry, undisciplined and pressed into service, lost all order, and took to looting the Ostrogothic camp rather than chasing the fleeing enemy. The Ostrogoths had then wrapped...
These are citizen soldiers pressed into service. This ain't the Roman legions of old. These are people who have just been trained up and equipped for this. This is not going to be the highest level of discipline you're ever going to find.
And fell upon his now totally disorganized infantry while they tried to loot what bounty they could. All order had disintegrated. It was a headlong rush back to the safety of the walls. He'd not lost too many men, but it was the worst they'd suffered since arriving in Rome. From here on, they would wait it out. But the Ostrogoths suffered too. Not long after the battle, the barbarians had sent an emissary to make peace. In order to work out the terms, they had agreed on a 3-month truce. But during these 3 months, Belisarius hadn't been idle. He had resupplied the city. His reinforcements had finally arrived, and he had fanned them out, slowly moving them to strategic locations all around the Ostrogothic force. Then, one night, the Ostrogoths tried to take Rome by surprise. But that simply wasn't going to happen on his watch. With this attempt foiled, and with his reinforcements slowly creeping toward their rightful capital, the Ostrogoths finally decided it was time to leave Rome. They burnt their camp and headed north. But Belisarius wasn't done with them yet.
And hey, that's quite a feat to defend this city, which, as we've talked about, was not necessarily the most defensible of cities. That's one of the reasons that Rome had been less important near the end of the Western Empire and why it hadn't served as the capital for a while, along with not being positioned very well. As I said, emperors wanted cities closer to the provinces. It also was not the most defensible city. That sort of wasn't the purpose of Rome. There were other cities that were much easier to defend from an enemy onslaught. So this is quite an achievement. Even though, Rome did certainly have some pretty impressive defenses. Even at this point, they were kind of crumbling a little bit, but the city certainly had defenses. But, this is still quite the achievement from old Belisarius.
Once half of them had crossed the Milvian Bridge, he unleashed his cavalry on those remaining on his side of the water, slaughtering the lot of them. Belisarius had at last completed Justinian's dream. Rome was once again truly part of the Roman Empire. And that brings this series to a close, but that is not the end of the story. We'll leave off at this high watermark for Justinian, Theodora, and Belisarius for now, but if our Patreon supporters vote in favor of it, we can come back to tell the rest of this tale and find out just what happens to Justinian's dream of a...
Alright, well, I guess I see how this worked. I see why this series is 12 episodes long. I guess they did half, and then, called for the patrons to do the rest. But yeah, this is a 12-episode series, so we have got, about the last half to go. So, yeah, in this episode, we saw Belisarius defending Rome against the Ostrogoths, achieving Justinian's goal, but he's not out of the deep end yet. Rome is essentially still surrounded to the north by Ostrogoth territory. It's still going to take a lot of resources and effort to reconquer that territory and defend the cities that have already been taken. This is not over yet. I'm sure we'll get into that next time. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon. It is linked down below. Now, I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.